The moment you see Mount Rushmore, 4 presidential faces carved into granite, you're looking at one of the most controversial monuments in America. But here's what they don't tell you in the tourist brochures. This mountain is built on stolen sacred land, and the story behind its creation reveals one of the most heartbreaking betrayals in American history. Today, we're diving deep into the real story of the Lakota people and how their most sacred site became a symbol of everything taken from them. Before we begin, I need you to understand something crucial. The Black Hills aren't just mountains to the Lakota people. They're the center of their spiritual universe, the place where their ancestors walked, where their ceremonies were born, and where their connection to the divine was strongest. Imagine someone taking your most sacred religious site and carving faces of foreign leaders into it. That's exactly what happened here, and the story is far more complex than most people realize. Let me take you back to a time when the Great Plains stretched endlessly, dotted with massive buffalo herds and the proud Lakota Nation. The Lakota, part of the larger Sioux Confederation, weren't just another Native American tribe. They were master horsemen, skilled warriors, and deeply spiritual people who had adapted perfectly to life on the plains. Their society was built around mobility, following the buffalo herds that provided everything they needed for survival. The Lakota called the Black Hills Pahasapa, which literally means hills that are black. But this wasn't just a geographical reference. To the Lakota, these hills were the axis mundi, the center of the world where earth meets sky. According to their creation stories, this is where the Lakota people first emerged from underground caves to walk the earth. Every mountain, every stream, every rock formation held sacred meaning. The hills were their cathedral, their Jerusalem, their Vatican, all rolled into one. For generations, the Lakota lived in harmony with this landscape. They hunted in the surrounding plains, but approached the Black Hills with reverence, using them for vision quests, ceremonies, and spiritual renewal. Young Lakota men would venture into these mountains seeking guidance from the spirits, fasting and praying until visions came to guide their path in life. The hills weren't just territory to be owned. They were a living, breathing sacred space to be respected and protected. Then came 1868, a year that would change everything. The United States government, eager to end costly conflicts with Plains tribes, signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie with the Lakota and other tribes. This wasn't just any agreement. It was supposed to be a permanent peace treaty that would finally establish clear boundaries and respect native sovereignty. The treaty explicitly stated that the Black Hills were Lakota territory, off limits to white settlement forever. But here's where the story takes a dark turn that reveals the true nature of these so-called permanent treaties. The treaty had barely dried when rumors began circulating about something that would make the government's promises worthless: gold. In 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills, ostensibly to scout for a fort location. What he really found was evidence of gold deposits, and when word got out, everything changed overnight. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills created an impossible situation. Thousands of prospectors and miners began flooding into Lakota territory, violating the treaty with every step they took. The Lakota watched in horror as their sacred sites were defiled by mining operations, their game driven away, and their spiritual practices disrupted by the chaos of a gold rush. They appealed to the government to enforce the treaty and remove the trespassers, but the response they received was devastating. Instead of honoring their agreement, government officials offered to buy the Black Hills from the Lakota. When that failed, they demanded the Lakota sell the land or face military consequences. This wasn't negotiation, it was extortion with the threat of violence backing it up. The Lakota refused, and rightfully so. How do you sell your most sacred site? How do you put a price on your connection to the divine? The government's answer was brutal and swift. They declared any Lakota not on reservations to be hostile and launched a military campaign to force compliance. This led to some of the most famous battles in American history, including Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn in 1876. But while the Lakota won that battle, they were fighting a war they could never win. The American military machine was too powerful, and the buffalo herds that sustained Lakota life were being systematically exterminated. By 1877, facing starvation and overwhelming military pressure, Lakota leaders were forced to sign a new agreement that essentially stole the Black Hills. But here's the crucial detail that makes this theft even more outrageous. This agreement was signed under duress, without the consent required by the original treaty, and by leaders who had no authority to give away sacred land. It wasn't legally valid then, and it wouldn't be legally valid now. The consequences were immediate and devastating. The Lakota were confined to reservations, their traditional way of life destroyed, their children forced into boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. Their sacred Black Hills were open to mining, logging, and eventually tourism. The mountains that had been the center of their spiritual universe became just another resource to be exploited by the conquering nation. But the ultimate insult was yet to come. In the 1920s, as America was establishing its identity as a modern nation, someone had a brilliant idea for promoting tourism in South Dakota. Why not carve the faces of American presidents into Mount Rushmore, a mountain the Lakota considered especially sacred? The irony is staggering, taking the most sacred site of a conquered people and carving the faces of their conquerors into it. The man behind this idea was Gutzon Borglum, a sculptor with known ties to the Ku Klux Klan. His original concept was even more offensive, initially including Confederate leaders before settling on Washington, Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Lincoln. The construction began in 1927 and continued for 14 years, blasting and carving away at a mountain the Lakota held sacred for millennia. Every blast of dynamite that shaped those presidential faces was like a spiritual wound to the Lakota people. They were forced to watch as their sacred mountain was transformed into a monument celebrating the very system that had destroyed their way of life. Washington, who owned enslaved people. Jefferson, who believed Native Americans should be removed or assimilated. Roosevelt, who championed westward expansion at native expense. And Lincoln, who despite his reputation, oversaw the largest mass execution in American history when 38 Dakota men were hanged in Minnesota. The completed monument became a powerful symbol, but not the one most visitors understand. To millions of tourists, Mount Rushmore represents American ideals and presidential leadership. To the Lakota, it represents the desecration of their most sacred site and the ongoing denial of their sovereignty. It's a constant reminder that their loss isn't ancient history. It's a living wound that continues to this day. The legal battle didn't end with the carving of Mount Rushmore. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Sioux Nation that the taking of the Black Hills was illegal and awarded the Lakota Tribes financial compensation. The court called it a more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealing than any in American history. But here's what makes the Lakota response so powerful and principled. They refuse the money. The Lakota have consistently refused over $1 billion in compensation because they don't want money for their sacred land. They want the land itself back. Their position is simple and morally unassailable. The Black Hills were stolen illegally, and justice requires their return, not financial compensation. This isn't about money. It's about justice, sovereignty, and the right to maintain their spiritual connection to their most sacred site. Today, the fight continues in ways both legal and cultural. Lakota activists regularly protest at Mount Rushmore, especially during major celebrations like Independence Day, pointing out the bitter irony of celebrating freedom on stolen sacred land. They've proposed alternative monuments, including the nearby Crazy Horse Memorial, though that project has its own controversies within Native communities. The story becomes even more complex when you consider the broader pattern of how Native sacred sites have been treated throughout American history. The Black Hills case isn't unique. It's part of a systematic disregard for Native American religious freedom that continues today. From Bears Ears to Mauna Kea, indigenous communities across America are still fighting to protect sacred sites from development, mining, and commercialization. What makes the Mount Rushmore situation particularly painful is how it's marketed and celebrated. Tourism materials rarely mention the Lakota people or the sacred nature of the land. School textbooks present it as a triumph of American engineering and artistry, without acknowledging the cultural destruction it represents. The gift shops sell miniature replicas, while the original inhabitants of the land struggle with poverty on nearby reservations. The environmental destruction adds another layer to this tragedy. The carving of Mount Rushmore altered the natural water flow in the area, affected wildlife habitats, and left behind tons of rubble at the base of the mountain. The sacred landscape that the Lakota had preserved for centuries was permanently scarred in just 14 years of construction. Recent years have brought renewed attention to this issue, particularly as America grapples with its historical treatment of indigenous peoples. Some activists have called for the removal of Mount Rushmore, though this remains highly controversial. Others propose adding context, requiring tourism materials to acknowledge the Lakota perspective and the history of the land before the monument was built. The Lakota themselves have different perspectives on the best path forward. Some focus on legal remedies, continuing to pursue the return of the Black Hills through courts and legislation. Others emphasize cultural preservation, ensuring that younger generations understand their connection to Pahasapa despite the ongoing occupation. Still others work on economic development that might eventually provide the resources needed for a larger political solution. What's clear is that this isn't ancient history that can be dismissed or forgotten. The Lakota people are still here, still fighting for justice, still maintaining their spiritual connection to the Black Hills, despite everything that's been done to sever it. Their struggle represents something larger than one tribe's grievance. It's about whether America can honestly confront its history and move toward genuine reconciliation with indigenous peoples. The next time you see Mount Rushmore in a movie, on a postcard, or in person, remember this story. Remember that those four faces are carved into a mountain that was stolen from people who held it sacred for thousands of years. Remember that the Lakota people never consented to this use of their land and continue to fight for its return. Remember that true patriotism might require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about how our national monuments came to exist. This story matters because it reveals fundamental questions about justice, sovereignty, and what we owe to the people whose lands our nation was built upon. The Black Hills remain sacred to the Lakota people, and their fight for justice continues. Understanding their story doesn't diminish America. It challenges us to be better, to live up to our highest ideals, and to find a path toward healing that honors both our complex history and our shared future.